Hello, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at the development of global trade from between 1450 and 1750. And now we're moving into Unit 4. So we're going to still be looking at the same period of time as the Unit 3, but now we're going to shift our attention mainly to West Europe at the beginning and looking at how West Europe begins to develop a connection with global trade. And this is the period of time that we're going to take the Americas and Afro-Eurasia and tie them together through a trade network. So we're going to be looking at two topics in this particular presentation. And our first one is going to deal with factors supporting exploration. So when we look at the access to the new technology, so one of the key things is that new technology is highly influential to the development of this European exploration or European maritime expeditions or European voyages, however you want to say it. So number one, and I see that my box is cutting it off, consequence of connection to the Islamic world. So one of the things that we know from Unit 1 and from Unit 2 and from Unit 3 is that West Europe was connected to the Islamic world through the Mediterranean Sea, through Spain, especially, but also through the Crusades, through the Byzantine Empire, through the city of Venice. West Europe did have connection to Islamic ideas and Islamic education and Islamic scholarly ideas, but also Islamic inventions. And what that does is it starts to allow these ideas to come into West Europe, and that's going to heavily influence what West Europe's about to do. So some of the ways that this manifests itself is through shipbuilding developments. So there's three different types of ships: the caravel, the carrack, and the flute. Now, these three different ships, believe it or not, you've seen them before. Anytime you've seen like a Columbus ship, or you've seen any of those ships from the from pirates and from the explorers and all of that time period, you can put them into these three categories. The Carvel and the Carack, primarily Portuguese and Spanish. The flute is more of a Dutch based ship. But here's the important thing: I want you to recognize all three of those terms and just recognize them as ship designs. Think of them as models for ships. All three of these ships are much sturdier and can survive in the open seas for a longer period of time. So these ships, they're longer and they're wider. So that means they're much more sturdy. They can put up with the open seas, which is important, but they can also transport more goods and resources. So if I'm going on a 4-week expedition, I need a ship that can hold 4 weeks of supplies. So I need a ship that has the cargo space, capacity to hold the supplies I need for long voyages. And then the other thing is I want my voyages to be profitable. So I want to be able to bring things back with me. And that means, again, I need a large cargo hold to do that. That's what these three different ships allowed for. They allowed for larger space to carry resources and cargo to make the trips possible, to make long trips possible, but also to make them profitable. The second is Latin sails. And we've talked about this before, this idea of what we would call triangular sails. And the advantage of a triangular sail is that it can catch wind from both sides. A square sail or a rectangular sail can only sail with the wind behind it. Triangular sail can catch wind from different directions and allow ships to travel into the wind. This was something that came out of the Indian Ocean through Muslim merchants into the Mediterranean Ocean. European sailors started to see this technology and they started to adopt it into their shipbuilding designs as well. And then, of course, the stern post rudder, which is a Chinese invention that makes its way through the Indian Ocean, works its way up to the Red Sea, makes its way into the Mediterranean. And this piece of technology allows for an ability to steer the ship more under control and give the ships more maneuverability. So when we look at number two, all of those things make the ships more more able to survive long voyages, and it makes them more capable of mobility. It just is a better form of transportation. And all of these ideas are largely coming from that Indian Ocean trade through the world of Islam to the European world. The third one is the navigational developments. It's nice to be able to go somewhere, but you need to be able to know where you're going. And this is where a Chinese invention, the magnetic compass, makes its way through the Indian Ocean. You're going to see this as a theme through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean. And it gets adopted eventually by the Europeans. Magnetic compass obviously allows people to determine north and south. And if you are able to determine your direction, then you're able to create a route that you can follow. The astrolabe is a Muslim invention which allows for the navigation of the stars. And it's an instrument that allows for the measurement of the stars on the horizon. And given a particular time of the year, you can calculate where north and south, where along the latitude lines you are on a map. So, I mean, it's actually quite amazing that people can figure this stuff out. But when I look at the stars, if I can map that out and know the angle at which it is related to the horizon, then I can figure out where I am on a map on the latitudinal lines in relationship to the equator. Can't necessarily figure out longitude. I can figure out latitude. The third one is the Portolani. And the Portolani is a map of ports. It basically lays out where the ports are and what distances they are. So it has a mapping technique, really more than anything. And we'll talk about more of that with cartography later. But the Portolani allows for an understanding of where ports are located, how far they are located from a particular point, and allows for the planning of these voyages to be much more accurate and therefore much safer. And then lastly, of course, we always have this understanding of global wind and current patterns. So we relate that back to the Indian Ocean. But once people start to figure out how the winds shift seasonally, then they can start planning out trade and start making trade more predictable and thus more safe and therefore more desirable. So when Europeans begin to figure out the wind patterns across the Atlantic Ocean or the current patterns across the Atlantic Ocean, voyages to the Americas will start to increase. And this is just going to be a common theme of the development of exploration. By the way, I should note when I say exploration, this is really West European exploration. It's not like the whole world was just sitting undeveloped, waiting for the Europeans to show up. By now, you should realize after our studies, there's vibrant communities involved in long distance trade throughout Afro-Eurasia. There's centralized kingdoms throughout the Americas. There's regional organizations of states throughout North America with the Mississippi civilization. West Europe, in a sense, is starting to connect into that greater world through what we call their age of exploration. We could talk about an age of discovery, but it's a discovery for the West Europeans of these new trade routes and these new lands. We can call them also maritime expeditions or transoceanic expeditions. And the idea is that some historians say that's much more accurate, that Europeans were crossing oceans for long term voyages, that really nothing was discovered because this stuff was already known to most of the population. So just keep that in mind. I use exploration because that's how I was taught it, and it takes a little while, but long term sea voyages, that will work. Now let's go back to the lecture. Letter B, the growth of the central states. So if you remember, West Europe is undergoing a process of centralization where we're getting centralized states developing. Spain has developed into a Christian state, kicking out the Muslims and Jewish populations. Portugal is centralizing. England is centralizing. France is centralizing. The Netherlands is pulling together. And the reason why this matters is because now these central states are able to fund the expeditions. These expeditions are expensive. Building the ships takes money. And these central states can provide the resources to make these expeditions possible. C, development of cartography. Cartography is basically map making. And the basic idea is that European map making became much better. And when you have accurate maps of the world, you're able to navigate the world much more effectively. D, why did the West Europeans do this? And this gets to the economic motives. The easiest way to say it is for you to think of this Indian Ocean trade network. Has a lot of money involved, has a lot of luxury items, has a lot of profit to be made. And Europe knows of this Indian Ocean world, is not foreign to them. But West Europe is trading through the Venetians. The Venetians are trading through the Muslims. The Muslims are trading throughout the Indian Ocean. So this creates a very indirect trade route for West Europe. And what West Europe wants to do is directly access this Indian Ocean market. So that idea of having direct access to the Indian Ocean was economically motivated by the West European societies because they were tired of working through middlemen. And if they have direct contact, they can reap direct profit. And they can also pay less for the product because they're directly engaged in the trade. So the desire to access Indian Ocean trade markets, particularly and importantly, the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, that was a big desire to get to access China. So to access China, India, the Southeast Asian Spice Islands, those were the big motivations of the West Europeans. And now they're developing the technology that would allow them to do that. The other thing is that there's competition amongst the European nations. One of the things we remember about West Europe is that for the most part, there's several states who are in constant competition. And this competition is going to push them to, seek out markets, to seek out trade routes, to seek out access to markets before somebody else does. And then the last thing that I put in is maritime powers. And this is to distinguish it from our last unit, Unit 3. Unit 3, we spent a lot of time talking about these land-based empires of Eurasia. Of Afro-Eurasia. We talked about the Songhai, the Tokugawa shogunate. We talked about the Ming and the Qing. We talked about the Safavid. We talked about the Moguls. We talked about Russia. But what West Europe is going to do, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the English, the French, and the Dutch. I'm going to repeat that one more time. These 5 European nations is who we're going to focus on. The Spanish and the Portuguese. That's where we're going to start it. And then we're going to be joined by the Netherlands, which we'll call the Dutch, the English, and the French. So Spanish, Portugal, English, French, and the Dutch. Those 5 nations, they're going to build up their empires, but their empires are going to be located overseas. So instead of France expanding throughout Europe, France is going to expand into North America. France is going to expand into the Caribbean. Spain is going to expand into South America. The Dutch are going to expand into the East Indies or into those Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. The idea is that their expansion, their buildup of empire is not going to be land-based, but overseas-based. And that's why we call them the maritime powers, because it's a reference to the overseas nature of the empire. And that's an important distinction to make. So we will move on to the Portuguese. So what I'm going to do is just kind of focus on the beginnings of the exploration. So this will kind of we'll set the ground for Portugal and Spain kind of connecting, if you will, to the greater Afro-Eurasian world and to the Americas. And then we will spend more time later talking about the way the empires look. So this is kind of a start. So everything I'm about to mention really belongs in the 1500s. So we'll start with the Portuguese expeditions. And we start first with a man named Prince Henry the Navigator, 1415. And Prince Henry a prince of Portugal. So he represents that large territorial state that has money. And Prince Henry is going to fund or provide the money for a series of expeditions down the West African coast. What Prince Henry believes is that by sailing down the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese can go around the tip of Africa and then make their way into that Indian Ocean trade network. And he's going to be right. He believes there is an all-water route around the tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean. So instead of having to go through the Mediterranean and working through the Venetians and, in this case, the Ottoman Empire, he can directly access the Indian Ocean. The problem is he doesn't know how far south Africa goes. So his expeditions are a series of explorations of the West African coast. The third thing that we want to put in with Prince Henry is that he begins a series of schools of navigation. And the schools of navigation are meant to train sailors in the new techniques of these new inventions of the lateen sail, in cartography techniques. It's meant to educate the Portuguese on the new information and new technologies coming to West Europe. So if you take a look at the map, you can see where they're going along West African coasts, setting up trading stops on a variety of islands off the west coast of Africa. We'll talk more about this later. In 1488, well after Henry the Navigator dies, 1488, Bartholomew Diaz makes a major breakthrough. And if you take a look at the west coast of Africa and look very tight to the coastline, you'll see it says Diaz 1487. And what Diaz is doing is getting closer and closer to the tip of Africa. He doesn't know that he is, but he's continuing a series of expeditions. And I always thought it was 1488, but 1487, 1488, he goes on an expedition. And when he goes around the Cape of Good Hope, you see how that line all starts to get squiggly? What happens is Diaz unknowingly reaches the tip of South Africa, what we call the Cape of Good Hope. And when the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean come together, those are some of the roughest waters in the world because you have two water systems kind of coming together, two sets of currents coming together. It makes for very rough waters. He gets blown off course because of a storm. He's in rough waters that he's never seen before. And when he finally begins to sail back, the land is on the wrong side. In other words, he figures out, I have found the tip of Africa. So Bartholomew Diaz, we credit for the Portuguese of discovering the tip of South Africa. And then we have Vasco da Gama. So if you take a look again at the map, and you'll see a line that kind of goes near Lisbon and then comes out to the Cape Verde Islands and then sails down outside of the Atlantic Ocean word and then goes around the tip of Africa. That's Vasco da Gama. So Vasco da Gama, what he does is he takes the trip around the tip of Africa and then begins to work up the east coast of Africa. Now he's coming into contact with the Swahili city-states. Now the Portuguese are becoming some of the first West Europeans to directly access the Swahili city-states. It's not like the Swahili states weren't actively involved in trade before this. They were. And once Vasco da Gama runs into city-states such as Mozambique and Mombasa and Melinda, he begins to know where he is because this is known to the West European world. They know of this trade. And then he just he waits for the winds and he takes the winds directly to India. And what Vasco da Gama does is he completes the trip from Portugal to India. And we have the creation of a new trade route, a trade route around Africa. So for Europe, we introduced this new trade route that directly connects them to the Indian Ocean. Now we're going to stop there because the next thing to talk about is how does the Indian Ocean change because of the introduction of the Portuguese and then later the Dutch, the English, and the French? And how does that introduction of those maritime empires change this region? Our second one, and this is our last slide, is the Spanish expeditions. So the Spaniards, they are going to go a different route, literally. Christopher Columbus, you probably know the story, even though I don't know. Maybe you don't know it because the other day my youngest son asked me who Christopher Columbus was, which made me go, wow, okay, this is where we are now. So Christopher Columbus poses the possibility that proposes the possibility that there is an all water route that goes across the Atlantic Ocean to the east, to the eastern regions, to India, to China, to the islands in that region. So what he's doing is he's saying if we go across the Atlantic Ocean, if we sail west, we're going to run into what we want to run into. We can access the Indian Ocean Trade Network from that side. And obviously, the Columbian voyages are going to have a huge impact on world history because, intentional or not, and I would argue it wasn't intentional, um, the Columbian voyages are going to initiate the integration of the Americas into the Afro-Eurasian world. In other words, we are now going to collect or connect, I should say, we're going to connect the Americas to Afro-Eurasia and create a truly global network of trade. And that's what the Columbian voyages are going to usher in. They are, as one historian put it, he goes, he found Columbus to be a despicable human being. And yet he said, these are the most consequential voyages ever taken in world history because it brings the Americas into the Afro-Eurasian community. The role of Ferdinand and Isabel, they are the Spanish king and queen. They are the ones who sponsor the voyages of Columbus. Once again, showing us the impact that the state had on this development of trade. So once Columbus comes in and starts to open up what he calls the New World, or opens up the Americas to Europe, Spain especially begins to send over more and more expeditions. And gradually it's figured out that indeed these are new lands that the Spaniards never knew of. They eventually figure out, and some people argue that Columbus knew it too, they weren't actually near India or near China. They weren't even close. So if you look at all that red in the map, this is what the Spanish are going to end up doing. They're going to end up colonizing and occupying this land and developing an overseas empire. And this is going to be largely accomplished by a group of people called the conquistadors. We'll talk in more detail about the conquistadors later, but for now, just know that the conquistadors represent Spanish soldiers slash explorers. What these Spanish soldiers slash explorers wanted to do was go into the new land for three purposes: gold, God, and glory. So the gold is the primary motivation to find riches and wealth and bring them not just for themselves, but also back to the state of Spain. So one is gold. The second is God. Missionaries are going to come along with the Spaniards, and missionaries are going to start converting Christianity. Prince Henry the Navigator had as a motivation missionary work. The Spaniards are going to keep that missionary motivation up, tying back into a theme we've talked about. As we have cultural interactions, missionaries go along for the ride and they spread the faiths as well. The third one, glory, deals more with the conquistadors individual. These conquistadors see a ticket to their wealth. And this gets to an interesting thing. I'm going to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent, but we're not going to stay on the tangent too long. In West Europe, there is a concept called primogeniture. And primogeniture is spelled Primogenitore. And basically, it translates to firstborn. So the firstborn of your next generation. And primogeniture laws said that the firstborn son would inherit all the wealth of the father. So that means if you're a second-born son or you're a third-born son, you're screwed. And so therefore, you need to go out and you need to make your own name. you need to make your own glory. And that was a big motivation for these conquistadors as well. So the conquistadors begin this Spanish exploration and Spanish conquest of North, South, and Central America, as well as the Caribbean. And everything you see on that map, that's all laid out in red, shows us where the conquistadors go and where the Spanish Empire begins to grow. Lastly, the expansion into the Pacific. So, a series of expeditions under the leadership of Magellan leave Spain in about 1519. And they begin the process of going down the South American eastern coast because they want to find that all water route to India. And eventually, the expedition goes around the around the Cape or the tip of South America. And they go through a waterway that's right through the tip called the Straits of Magellan. So when they come through the Straits of Magellan at the tip of South America, they then go into the Pacific Ocean and they begin a very long voyage because nobody knew how big the Pacific Ocean really was. And pretty soon, the Magellan voyages, the Magellan expeditions, are going to land in the Philippines. And the Philippines are going to be taken as a Spanish territory. So now you've got this Spanish presence in Southeast Asia. And the Philippines are located, basically where the Spice Islands are, to the south of Japan. And the Spanish presence is going to start setting up in the Philippines. Once they start sailing away from the Philippines and they start going to west, they start reconnecting into the Indian Ocean trade network. They go around the tip of Africa and then back up to Spain. So over the 2 years, Magellan's expeditions successfully circumnavigates the globe. They go around the globe. And this is an accomplishment for human beings. I mean, it's the first time that we know of this being done. Magellan didn't make it for the trip. Somewhere along the islands, it depends who you listen to. Some people say Magellan got caught up in a war with natives in an island that they landed on in the Pacific. And during this battle, he was killed in battle. Others say that his crew was just so sick of him, they just dropped him off at an island and left him there to die. Either way, Magellan doesn't make it all the way back. We often say that the Magellan expeditions are the ones that made it around the globe for the first time. And what's happening, and this is probably the most important thing, is that new trade routes are being established. So if you remember, I talked about these trade routes of the Indian Ocean, Silk Road, the Trans-Saharan trade, and the Mediterranean. Now we have 2 new trade routes developing, actually 3. We have one that goes straight across the Atlantic Ocean, which we call the transatlantic trade. We also have another one that goes around Africa to the Indian Ocean. And then we have a third one between the west coast of North America and Asia, which we would call the Trans-Pacific trade. So now these new trade networks are developing, and that's going to certainly change how the globe interacts. And it's also going to shift power over to the Europeans. But that's for another lecture. So in the meantime, I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy. As always, bring your questions to class, and I will see you next time. Bye.